Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to set up a PA speaker system using the Mackie DL16S wireless mixer. You could also apply this to any other DL mixer lines from Mackie, and you can also apply this to the analog mixing consoles as well. They're just a little bit of a different setup, but essentially they do the same thing. I'm also going to show you a couple of other variations of setting up a PA speaker system using a combination of two main front of house speakers, or using two subwoofers, or even just a mono setup just using a single speaker and sub. So let's get into it. So in this first example, we're going to be looking at your traditional and typical stereo speaker setup. That's your left and right speakers. On the front here, we've got my DL16S wireless mixer. Don't worry too much about all these yellow, blue, green, and red cables. They're just permanently there for my default setup. What we're going to focus on is the outputs of the main left and right. So you're going to need two XLR cables, one for the left speaker and one for the right speaker. So here we've got a pair of Wharfedale Pro Typhon AX12 speakers. We're just going to plug straight into the speaker. So I've got my left side, or my left channel, into the speaker, and I'm going into input A. Okay, my left speaker is done. I'm now going to take the other XLR cable, which is designated to the right side, and do the exact same thing to the right speaker. For this demonstration, I'm going to be playing a little bit of music into the mixer into channels 15 and 16. You can see the signal coming through, and they are both coming through mono on each of those channels. But what I want to do is set them up as a stereo. The reason for this is I don't want to have to control two faders for a single audio source. So what I'm going to do in the Master Fader app is link channel 15 and 16 together. And now I can control the volume of both channel 15 and 16 using a single fader. And once we raise the main front of house volume, you can see that there is now a stereo send coming in. This is both the left and right side of the speakers, and this is channel 15 and channel 16. So now that we've got our main left and right speakers set up, let's say we want to add some subwoofers. What you can do is use the output of the speakers going from the main front of house down into the subwoofers. However, depending on the brand, they might recommend a different setup. For Wharfedale Pro, I do believe they prefer that the signal from the mixer goes into the subwoofers first, and then you link them up to the top speakers. So here's what that looks like. You're going to take the left output from the mixer using the XLR cable and go straight into input A on the subwoofer. Next, you're going to take a completely separate XLR cable and use the output of channel A from the subwoofer and link that up into input A of your top speakers. After you've done that with the left subwoofer and left top speaker, you're going to do the exact same thing with the right side, and then link that subwoofer up to the top speaker, again, that you've designated to the right side. Now you can control the volume of both the subwoofers and the top speakers using your main front of house master fader. Now here's a little variation for you. Let's say you've only got one subwoofer. How do you set this up? Well, if you've got a subwoofer like mine that has dual inputs, you're going to take both the left and right output from your mixer and plug them into the back of the subwoofer. Left side is going to go into channel A, right side is going to go into channel B. You're then going to use the outputs A and B and assign them to your left and right top speakers. So just to clarify, this is the left signal from my mixer, and this is the right signal coming from my mixer. I'm now going to need two separate XLR cables. This first XLR cable is going to go into output A, and my second XLR cable is going to go into output B. One of them is going to be for the left signal, and one of them is going to be for the right signal. Starting with the left side, I'm going to take the XLR cable coming out of output A and link that up to the top speaker into input A. This is my left side done. I'm now going to do the exact same thing with output B, except this is going to go to the right side top speaker, and I plug that in the same way into input A. Essentially what's happening is the subwoofer is taking the left and right signal from my mixer, and it's going to convert it into a mono signal only for the low frequencies. But what it's also going to do is allow me to send the left signal to a left side speaker and a right signal to the right side speaker. For this next example, I'm going to show you how to separate the left and right main mix from the subwoofer mix, essentially giving you individual control over the low frequencies and the mid and high frequencies. On the DL16S, I've got a total of 6 auxiliary outputs. The first 5 I'm going to use for my in-ear monitors, and for the 6th auxiliary output, I'm going to designate that for the subwoofers only. You could do this on analog discs as well, but you may have to play around with different cables because some may only have a jack output compared to an XLR output. So these 2 cables are my main left and right. I'm going to assign these 2 towards the top speakers. This cable here is going to be for my subwoofers, and I'm going to run these subwoofers in a mono setting. For most gigs and performances, I never really run my subwoofers in a stereo setting. There's really no point to run subwoofers in a stereo setting. I'm now taking the XLR cable from the auxiliary 6 output and running that into the input A of my subwoofer. I'm then going to take a separate XLR cable and use output A of the subwoofer, and I'm going to plug the other end of that XLR into input A of the other subwoofer. So now auxiliary 6 is providing a separate volume control or separate signal for my 2 subwoofers. They are now running in mono, meaning both of them will be controlled with one fader and run at the same volume. Now if you're wondering why the hell would you set them up like this, well, sometimes I don't want to be running all the low end into my top speakers. I want the top speakers to focus all their wattage and power and focus them on the mids and highs, and get the subwoofers to focus on the low end. This is actually going to allow your top speakers to drive a little bit harder than what they normally would because they're not going to be playing any low frequencies. So here's how it looks in the Master Fader app. I've got my music playing. This is still running in stereo, and it's coming out of my main front of house, left and right, a stereo mix. Now if I go over to auxiliary 6 that I've assigned as a subwoofer, I can add the volume of that and control the overall output volume of those subwoofers. Again, sometimes you might have a really bass heavy audio playing and you think the bass is a little bit too much. You can individually control this without affecting your main left and right speakers. On top of that, I wouldn't assign any of the low frequencies to things like vocals. I would assign them to things like a kick drum or a bass guitar. So now I've got my subwoofers playing the bass and kick drum. Now if I switch back to the main front of house, there's no need for me to put the bass guitar or the kick drum into the subwoofer. Although the bass guitar does have a lot more frequency range, so I'm going to add a little bit to the main front of house, but for the kick drum, isn't going to be worth it. For the singers, guitars, snare, overhead left and right, I can put those on the main front of house because those are predominantly in the mid to high frequency range, but I'm not really going to use them in the subwoofer mix. Depending on what you want your mix to sound like, you can just pick and choose how much you want to add to your subwoofer mix. Okay, let's say you want to set up a stage monitor or an in-ear monitor. For this example, I'm just going to use a stage monitor. I've just taken one of the speakers and tilted it on its side. So the DL16S has 6 auxiliary outputs. The mixer you might be using might have a bit more or it might have a bit less, but essentially we're just going to assign one of these channels for the monitor. In this demonstration, I'll take an XLR and plug it into auxiliary 1 and then run the other end of that cable to my floor monitor. Depending on what kind of speaker or floor monitor you're using, the setup is exactly the same. Just find input A or input 1 and plug the other end of that XLR into that channel. Okay, so back into the Master Fader app, we've got our music playing. I'm then going to switch over to auxiliary 1, and you can see the audio signal coming through, but I haven't actually added volume to the fallback monitor yet. So I'll just bring the fader up and then bring up the master volume for that auxiliary channel. You can see the signal is now coming through for that floor monitor, and depending on how many auxiliary channels you have, you can do this to any number of these channels. Maybe some channels you'll want to add audio to it, sometimes you don't want to add audio to it. It's up to you. Now for this last example, I'm going to show you how you can set up a mono mix. What I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to choose one of the auxiliary channels. For this demonstration, instead of using the left and right, I'm actually going to use auxiliary number 6. The reason for that is I already know that on the Master Fader app and most analog desks, the auxiliary channels by default on pretty much every desk that I've worked with are set up in some kind of mono setting. So I'll take an XLR cable, plug it into auxiliary output 6, and then run the other end of that cable to my speakers. I'm not going to be using the left and right. I'm just going to strictly use the auxiliary output. And you can do this too on your mixer, whether it's an analog desk or a digital desk. There's nothing wrong with using the left and right on your desk. It can be done, but for this example and this demonstration, I'm just going to use the aux channel. I'm now going to take my XLR and plug it straight into my top speaker, into channel A. So I've just got one speaker and a mono signal. Let's say I want to also use a subwoofer. It works the same way. I'll take that mono signal from the aux channel and plug it into input A of my subwoofer. I'll then take a separate XLR cable, plug that into output A of my subwoofer, and then link that to my top speaker into channel A. Now I've got a mono setup with a top speaker and a subwoofer. And here we are back in the Master Fader app. And if I wanted to, I could use the main front of house, but then I would have to just pan everything to the left or keep everything dialed in the middle. Sometimes it's a little bit too fiddly depending on what kind of mixer or what kind of situation you're in. So this is why I prefer just going straight into an aux channel. So I was using this as the subwoofer example. I'm just going to change this to mono mix. And you can see on the master fader of this main mono channel that it is a mono mix rather than a stereo. So pretty much everything I add to this auxiliary channel is going to come out in a mono signal rather than stereo. If you're not sure how to tell the difference between mono and stereo, if you look closely at the volume meters, you can see that there are two individual bars squished together. But when it comes to a mono signal, you can see that they are just single individual light meters. And I can control them all using one single fader. This is going to come out as a mono mix. So no stereo sounds, just straight down the middle. Now, if you made it this far and you still can't get a signal to come through in your mono mix, just double check your auxiliary settings to make sure they are not post fader. Okay, so post fader means anything on the main front of house console will affect what is happening in your auxiliary mix. So if all the faders are down on my main front of house mix, even though I'm on my auxiliary channel, I'm not going to hear anything. I need to change this to pre-fader. So adjusting the volume, adjusting the settings before the main front of house faders. You can see when I switch to post fader, the volume drops. But if I add some volume to my main front of house mix, and I come back to the mono mix, you can see I've got a bit of a signal here. If I go back to the main front of house, turn the volume down, it's gone. So that's why you want to run this in a pre-fader setup. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions about setting up a PA system using your mixer or have any questions about some of the examples that I've shown, just leave me a comment and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thanks for watching.